The member from Lennox, Frontenac, Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox and Addington.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for Canada's newest welfare premier. Premier, we can all see the economic tailspin that you and your deputies have created for this province. But it wasn't long ago when, in fact, this province was the best place to be. We had 6- and 7-figure job growth, and we had balanced budgets. We had an explosive industry investment, red tape reduction, and we were paying our way in Confederation. Due to your lack of leadership, we now have 6-figure job losses, deficit budgets, and industry is fleeing. And now we're on the dole. Officially, we're a have-not province. Do you think that implementing your new blended sales tax will fix the damage you've done over 6 years?
The Premier.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do want to say to the honourable member that I think that there's much in the question, by the tone of the question and in the rhetoric of the question, Mr. Speaker, that most members of this legislature, and I dare say quite a few members of that member's very own party, might want to disassociate themselves. At its fundamental heart, that question, Mr. Speaker, speaks of an Ontario that's very different than the one that we see and that we think most of the people of the province see. As an example, Mr. Speaker, he said he'd like to see an Ontario that was paying our way in Confederation. Mr. Speaker, through transfers to the Government of Canada, Ontario continues to be the single biggest contributor to Confederation.
Absolutely. Supplementary.
Through you, Speaker, to the Deputy. Last week, the Premier was in Ottawa picking up Ontario's first welfare check. What a proud moment for Ontario. I did notice something a little bit out of character, though. There were no lights, there were no cameras, and there was no big photo op with his check and adoring fans. It was almost like it didn't happen. But it did, and it's embarrassing that Canada's economic engine is now on the dole. You've taken us from first place to last place in Confederation. And with this latest blended tax grab, it's clear that you can't even steer a course for economic recovery. Deputy Premier, Ontario is now on welfare. Why are you further crippling our recovery with this new BS tax?
I just asked the honourable member to withdraw that last comment, please.
I'll withdraw. I'll withdraw.
Deputy.
Well, thank you very much. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, I want to use the beginning point of this answer to develop even further the contrast that exists in our spirit and our sense of the people of the province of Ontario and that honourable member and perhaps that party in which he sits. And I hear one or two perking up, Mr. Speaker, like the one from Halton who has previously expressed this view, that we should be embarrassed to be people in the province of Ontario. Instead, Mr. Speaker, we're Mr. Speaker, we see our place in the history of our country as a privileged role, an important role, and we continue to be dependent upon to support the services in the Government of Canada, Mr. Speaker. Ontario continues to be the largest single contributor to the net proceeds that the Government of Canada distributes elsewhere in our country. This is a role that we have always played. These are challenging times in Ontario, and that's why our budget, Mr. Speaker, makes the biggest single investments in the history of our province related to infrastructure, and why we protect essential public services in these challenging economic times.
Final supplementary.
Deputy, you can't continue to squeeze productivity out of people and increase the cost of public administration. You continue to expand public sector jobs while sticking it to hard-working people and businesses who create the wealth you spend so freely. On this side, we know that you need to go sell this blended sales tax somewhere else. People know it's just another Liberal BST tax. Deputy Premier, did you give Ontario workers a second thought before you brought the hammer down and put the screws to them for the finishing touch?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the leader of that party himself said, with respect to this tax that the honourable member has just spoken about, that he supports it both in principle and in theory. And, Mr. Speaker, we have many commentators who suggest that this initiative is the biggest single contribution that can be made to enhancing the competitiveness of our jurisdiction, which is about getting people, Mr. Speaker, in opportunities for employment and to prosper in our society. In terms of public services, Mr. Speaker, we know the history of that party.
Yes.
We had in our budget a commitment to reduce the Ontario Public Service by 5%, but we make no apology, Mr. Speaker, for the fact that under the last 5 years, under the leadership of Premier Dalton McGuinty, there are more nurses working in the province of Ontario. We will not apologize that there are more police officers on duty in the province of Ontario, and we will not apologize, Mr. Speaker, that people inspect labour sites and opportunities where the environment is to be protected. These are all additional public servants under the McGuinty government, and we do not apologize for that, Mr. Speaker.